So who really owns the mobile market? If you follow the tech space, you might think the mobile landscape is just this simple numbers game, kind of like a winner-take-all battle, dominated by a single player who's just hoarding the vast majority of users. But what if I told you that treating this ecosystem as one giant unified audience is actually costing developers and brands literally millions of dollars?
Welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely pumped to unpack this one for you today, because we are looking at a really fascinating breakdown of the 2026 smartphone ecosystem. We're drawing on some fresh data from Counterpoint Research and Digital Applied, and honestly, we're going to completely dismantle the idea of a single global mobile market. Because as you'll see, the reality is that it's a tale of two entirely different worlds.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the volume versus value divide, then map out the mirror markets, explore the version adoption gap, look into hardware and price tiers, and finally wrap it all up with a 2026 strategic playbook.
Let's dive right into Section 1, the volume versus value divide. It's truly a market in two halves.
The absolute core thing we need to wrap our heads around today is that the global mobile landscape, it's not one market. It is two entirely different markets that just happen to share the same overarching industry label. When you look at the global active device share across all geographies, the volume dominance is just undeniable. Android holds a massive 70.6%. To put that into perspective, that means Android powers roughly 7 out of every 10 active handsets worldwide right now. iOS sits at 28.7%, with a tiny fraction belonging to other operating systems. So if you're just looking for scale, Android is the undisputed king of volume.
But here's the million-dollar, or rather, the multi-billion-dollar question. If Android has all the users, why does iOS make all the money? Looking at 2025, consumer app spend represents a complete inversion of that volume data we just looked at. The App Store generated $94 billion compared to Google Play's $55 billion. So the absolute crucial takeaway here is that while iOS is on fewer than 3 out of 10 devices, it somehow captures an astonishing 64.2% of all consumer app spending. Long story short, Android is the volume platform, iOS is the revenue platform.
Moving on to Section 2, mapping the mirror markets and looking at regional extremes. Because you see, those global averages completely mask some massive regional extremes. Treating global as a single audience will almost certainly lead you to the wrong product decisions. Let's look at Q1 2026. In the US, iOS leads with a 59% share. But then look at China. Android holds 63%, and Huawei's HarmonyOS is actually overtaken iOS, sitting at 19% compared to Apple's 17%. Then we pivot over to India, where Android holds an overwhelming 90% of the market. This right here brilliantly illustrates why building a single app with one broad global strategy is simply no longer a realistic approach.
To push that point even further, let's compare the extremes side by side. Japan, its 68.2% iOS, and the US, its 60.9%, are practically different planets compared to top Android markets like India at 95.7% or Nigeria at 91.3%. If you're building a product today, your mobile-first audience demands targeted, localized product decisions. An app built for Tokyo just cannot assume the same hardware or network realities as an app built for Lagos. It just doesn't work.
Which brings us to Section 3, the version adoption gap, fragmentation versus unification. Okay, so once you know what operating system your users have, you got to know what version they're actually running. iOS 18 reached an incredible 84.2% of active iPhones in just 19 months post-launch. On the flip side, Android 15 and 14 combined are sitting at 69.9%. Apple's rapid OS adoption is literally like a rocket ship, giving a massive operational advantage to iOS developers. If you're building for iOS, you can safely drop older versions and use the newest software tools way faster than you can on Android, which historically has this very long tail of older, fragmented versions still in active use.
However, I should point out that narrative is slowly shifting. Major Android manufacturers, we're talking Google Pixel and Samsung, are now committing to unprecedented 7-year cycles for OS and security updates on their flagship phones. Over time, these extended update windows will stretch the lifespan of newer Android versions, meaning that historically wide version gap between iOS and Android is slowly beginning to narrow.
All right, Section 4, hardware and price tiers, the premium duopoly.
$903. That is the massive average selling price of an iPhone globally as of 2025. This single number proves Apple's absolute iron grip on the premium tier of the smartphone market. When your average customer is spending over $900 on a device, they have a proven willingness to pay. And that ties right back to why iOS drives so much app revenue.
Now, immediately follow that up with this, $315. That's the average selling price for Android devices across all brands. And what's fascinating here is that this number isn't just about cheap phones. It's heavily driven by entry-level brands like Transient, the makers of Tecno and Infinix, who are just dominating emerging markets in Africa and South Asia. The hardware realities at $315 are vastly, vastly different from $903.
Because when you look strictly at the premium tier, meaning smartphones costing $800 or more, it is an impenetrable duopoly. Apple commands a staggering 71.4% of this premium market, with Samsung taking 18.6%. Everyone else, they're left fighting for the remaining 10%. If your app requires heavy processing power, these are the devices you're building for.
And let's not forget, hardware tiers directly impact connectivity too. Just look at global 5G adoption. 73.4% of active iPhones are connected to 5G compared to just 51.8% of Android devices. iOS sets a much higher network ceiling. If you're an app team shipping high bitrate video or huge data bundles, you can pretty much rely on fast networks for iOS users. But for Android, you still have to account for a massive population of budget devices running solely on LTE networks.
Let's bring it all together in Section 5, the 2026 Strategic Playbook. Here are your actionable takeaways.
Let's translate all that macro data into micro decisions for you developers out there. Step 1. Based on the adoption data, you can confidently set your minimum supported version to iOS 16 and Android 12 without losing any meaningful share of users. Step 2. If you're testing an app in North America, weight your A/B tests 60-40 in favor of iOS to mirror where the revenue comes from, rather than just the raw global user split. And Step 3. If you're targeting emerging markets, you absolutely must tightly cap your animation and memory budgets to 4 GB of RAM because, well, that is the reality of entry-level Android hardware.
And for the marketing teams, here are your targeted directives. First off, bid your paid media by device tier, not just by OS. An entry-level Android user and a premium Android user are entirely different customers. Second, if your business model relies on ad support or utility at a massive scale, you want to launch Android first. But third, if you're selling premium subscriptions, your user acquisition strategy must be iOS first, weighting your efforts by regional revenue potential rather than raw install volume.
So, we've seen the current state of play, but there are massive, localized disruptions coming right at us. The EU's Digital Markets Act is forcing open iOS to alternative app stores, and over in China, Huawei's HarmonyOS has already overtaken Apple. So the big question is, how will these regional seismic shifts eventually shatter the global duopoly? It's an incredibly fascinating space, and the data proves that understanding these nuances is the only real way to win. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.